When I first started out, I wasn't thinking of this massive volume of work ahead of me that I have to complete. I was thinking, let me just write a story. I've done this before. I can write a story. I really just thought of it one day at a time. And that was crucial because if I thought about it anything else, I wouldn't have been able to accomplish it, I don't think.
Welcome to The Creator's Journey. I'm your host, Charles Gupton. In each show, I'll talk with creative leaders who face the same fears and obstacles we all face. What makes these folks effective are the processes they've developed that allow them to push through the darkness to consistently ship their work and make a difference. If you've ever felt that your fears and insecurities are getting the best of you, just know that you're not alone. Every creator who works from the heart faces the same challenges. I would love for you to join our community at thecreatorsjourney.com for ideas and inspiration that will bring light and direction to your journey.
Here's the key to my front door. You got a pillow if you lost yours. You got a seat at my table. You got a home. Here's somebody who believes you. Let truth remind you. You've always got a place to go to. You got a home.
I met Nicholas Saylor just minutes after his presentation at Creative Mornings several weeks ago. He just rocked the space at the Contemporary Art Museum in Raleigh talking about his new book, A Story Each Day. Although the handful of stories he read were riveting, just about all I could focus on were the mindset and processes he must have had in place to generate an original story every day throughout 2014, when his project was initiated. In 2015, Nicholas posted each of the stories that he had written on that date from the year before. Throughout the year, he built a following for the project, launched a Kickstarter campaign to publish the collection, then had the project completed and in circulation by the end of the year. All this while working full-time as a creative leader at Betabox Labs. Nicholas is an accomplished filmmaker as well, having won recognition for a couple of short films, including an official selection screening of his film, The Strong One, at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 2012. Nicholas, welcome to The Creator's Journey, and thanks for inviting me into your innovation headquarters for a chat.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking and telling the story, getting into the process behind a story each day.
Great. Let's start off. Tell me a little bit about Betabox Labs and what you do here.
Yeah, so Betabox Labs was a company that I helped launch with a good friend of mine from school. Basically, we were both really interested in what's called makerspaces, spaces where people go and they work on a lot of cool technology, 3D printers, 3D scanners, laser cutters, things like that. And so we put all of this technology into a shipping container. And we partnered with a good friend of ours who's an architect who is also a co-founder and renovated the shipping container to make it into basically a fully mobile space. And so now we have these fully mobile spaces that we rent out to companies, schools, and we're actually building a second one right now. It's going to be sort of launching in April. And that one is really cool because it's entirely modular. So if you're not really into the whole prototyping side of things, you can slide in, demo space or a recording studio or different things like that. So it's not just a mobile makerspace now; it's a mobile space just for flexible use.
Incredibly innovative.
It's a lot of fun. It's really, really cool. And it's exciting because there aren't a whole lot of other companies doing this. Very few. I could count them on one hand. And no one's doing it exactly like we are. And so anytime you're doing something that no one else is doing, you have to figure a lot of things out for yourself.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I want to get into your story each day process, but first, I want to go back into some of your journey that led up to that project. Tell me about your early storytelling days and how your student filmmaking endeavors shaped your path.
Yeah, definitely. Well, before we talk about the student filmmaking, I actually want to go a little bit further back, which is really interesting. So I grew up, and my family was very much. They saw stories as very important, and so especially reading and that sort of thing. And one thing that my mom and dad did that was really impactful and influential in the way I was raised was my parents would read to me and my siblings every single day.
Wow.
And so it was really cool because that, like, you know, when I'm young, I still have a very active imagination, but I had a very vivid imagination. And so, you know, I would just sit there and listen to these stories being read and just imagine all sorts of things. And that was sort of, I think, the spark and the initial seed of like this interest in storytelling. And so that was the way I was raised. And then in high school, I found out about a film competition. I was like, all right, I'm going to enter. I don't even think I considered whether or not I was going to enter. I was just like, I'm going to enter. And so I got some friends together, and, you know, we put this 30-minute long thing together that was supposed to be scary, but I think only one person out of the entire people who viewed it actually had jumped at the jump scene. So when I got to college, I was still really excited about filmmaking, and there was a competition where you make a 5-minute short film in a week. And so the first year I got some friends together and did that. The second year I teamed up with another team who the previous year I had competed against. So I teamed up with them, and then we ended up winning that competition, and that film won Best Editing in this whole sort of competition. And then the next year after that was when I made a film called The Strong One, which you mentioned. And that one was quite an experience, just pulling everything together in that 1 week. And then it won at the local level, and so it went on to be screened in Hollywood. And me and the other filmmakers went out there, and, you know, we got to meet people, and there it won Best Picture at this festival, and I won Best Directing.
Oh, cool.
And then it was also screened at Cannes. So it was a really cool experience in the step in this direction. And one of the cool things was this was actually based on a poem that one of our friends had written. And so I think it's interesting that, you know, with these short stories, they're small little glimpses into people's lives or characters' lives.
Right.
And very similar to how the short film worked. It was just a small glimpse into really our friend's memories. It was his memories of growing up and his memories of how he felt. And so I think that in some way he almost inspired me. And I kept a hold of this memory of, like, you know, this made a really, really great short film because it was just such a poignant memory. And it was turned into a film, and it was such a great story. And so I think from there, I really took a little bit of inspiration to writing these stories.
Well, you had talked in the Creative Mornings session a fair amount about collaboration, building communities, and ideas. How much of that came from some of those early processes?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting because I would definitely say, you know, any sort of creative work has to come from a team or a community. And so when I was in college, a lot of these films that I made, I also made a feature-length film. That film in particular was very dependent on the community that I had built. I had worked with everyone to some different capacity. And then finally everything just sort of came together, and we were able to work for about 2 years on this film. So we were shooting, you know, on weekends for 6 months, and then we went back to editing, and then we sort of had to go back into filming a little bit for a month or two. And then it was a very long post-production process. And so everyone had their place, and it was really interesting because right after this film was released, this feature-length film was released, everyone in the crew sort of their lives sort of shifted. Like some of them, a lot of them got married. A lot of the actors got married. A lot of people moved. A lot of people started new jobs. I moved right afterward. So it was interesting because it was like the one time in everyone's life when this was possible.
Man.
And now everyone is, you know, so busy and
scattered
and married and have kids and different jobs and things that they wouldn't really be able to come together and do that. So it was very special, I think, for everyone involved because of that.
That's incredible. Well, as a filmmaker, is there one or possibly two films that have had a great impact on you in your vision and your thought, whether it's the storytelling or visually or whatever?
Yeah. So the films that I really like, I really love Tree of Life. Just visually, that's an amazing film. And so I love the way that like it almost, the story is not very precise. Like two people could watch it and have different ideas of what actually happens, but it's so beautiful and it tells a story just so visually that anytime I want to shoot something, I'm just like, man, I should just shoot it like that. That's not always the case though, because they're just amazing people who worked on that film. I think that in terms of storytelling, the ones that I really connect with are the ones that seem very raw and seem very, very vulnerable. One in particular that I'm thinking of is, I think it's called Breathe or Breathe In. I think it's just called Breathe. And it's not a very, it wasn't a huge film, but just the way that it was very subtle about how these people felt. It was very vulnerable. It's about a musician, a man who's middle-aged, and he teaches I think music at high school, and so but you get the idea that in the impression that he had wished that he had been like a rock star. He really wanted to just be a musician full time, and then he sort of got married and settled down, and he wasn't living in New York City. He was living a little bit outside of it, but you could tell like he really wanted to be a musician in New York City, and so his family gets an exchange student, and he sort of starts to fall in love with this exchange student. And so it's a very vulnerable film. Like there are certain times in the film where you feel uncomfortable. It's like, wow, like should I feel this about these characters? But I think that's a really powerful thing about stories is that sometimes when you share those vulnerable things, you start to realize, wow, like it's not just one person. It's not just me that feels these vulnerable things. There are a lot of people out there. And when you start to talk about those things, oftentimes you can really find a connection with your audience.
Wow. I had an engaging conversation with Pam Slim a short while back for the show around her book, Body of Work, which, of course, you build over a lifetime. You've got some very acute observations around building your body of work around stories and how your filmmaking transitioned over time into writing.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing was, when I was in school, it was a lot of fun to make these films. It was a lot of fun to release them and show them to my friends, and we'd all talk about how we did the effects and sort of the stories behind the actual production of it. But right after I graduated, I moved to New York City. I was working there. And going back to that idea of community, I realized it was very difficult or it would take a long time to find that community where we all trusted each other and we all wanted to make films. And then even after that, I started to realize filmmaking, it has a very long feedback loop, right? So feedback loop, I mean, like you make a film, you don't actually find out what people think about it until a while after it's released.
Long time.
Yeah, and then it takes a while for it to actually make it. Like most films, at least a year. If it's 6 months, it's like pretty quick. So I started to think about my role in storytelling and how I was going to approach storytelling because. Right. I wanted something where I wasn't having to wait 2 years to get feedback on what kind of stories were going to be the most successful. And so in that process, I started to think about, okay, what are some ways that I can do this? What are some ways I can put my stories out there, immediately get feedback, find out which ones are successful, and then move forward with that as maybe a film. And so writing was definitely the place where it sort of started. It was almost like you see filmmaking as a finished product, but what's the step before that? That's the quickest and cheapest and easiest way to get feedback on a story. And then there's also the whole aspect of probably what this author is talking about with body of work is you're not going to be able to acquire an audience unless you continually or regularly release some kind of work. And so if your work is once every year, once every 2 years, you only have a very limited window of time where people can actually connect with you.
Right.
And so with these stories, writing them every single day, it gave me the amazing opportunity to connect with people every single day. Right. And you just hear the title, a story each day, and you realize like, oh, like I'm waking up in the morning, oh, there's a new story.
I know what's coming.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was one additional thing that sort of added and inspired and maybe added some fuel to this project.
Well, speaking of New York, in your transition, if I remember correctly, there were a couple of stories that came out of there that had an impact on your process. One is from a conversation with a violinist, if I remember correctly, and another from a friend that was documenting the layering of paint onto a cup over a course of a year. How do those two events shape your notion around time and stories?
Yeah, so this was a couple months after I had moved to New York. I moved to New York in the summer of 2013, and just getting used to the city, all of this kind of stuff, and I got involved in an artist group, and it was sort of a weekly thing. A different artist would talk about their work, what their process was, and share some of what they were doing. And there was one musician, she was a violinist, like you said, and she played some of her music, very beautiful, obviously, and then started to talk about her process. And we were like, oh, how often do you practice, that sort of thing? And she said, oh, I've been practicing every single day for the past 25 years. And that just blew my mind. I can't think of anything I've done for the past 25 years. I'm 25 now. So what have I done since I was, born? And so I started to think about this, and I was like, wow, she's so dedicated to this craft. She's so dedicated. She clearly knows exactly what she wants to be doing. And at that point in time, I had sort of decided as my mission, almost like a mission statement for my life, in a way. I mean, that sounds like a very broad statement, but I felt very fundamentally that telling stories was a great way, maybe the best way, to communicate truth. And that's very important to me. And so just investing in stories was very valuable to me. And I started to think, okay, maybe I could write a story every single day. Maybe this is something that I could do. I can't make a film every single day, but I might be able to write a story every single day. And I had written some short stories at that time. And so I was sort of mulling this idea around, just thinking, okay, that would be interesting. And then I also had a friend that I had met in New York, and she was an artist, sort of a fine artist. And she had a project about New York as well. And she had moved to New York from California, and one of her projects was just sort of born out of this idea that in New York, in the subways, when something gets scratched or scraped, they just paint over it. And so there are these layers, and then if you see more scratches, you can almost see the layers, different colors over different years.
Right.
And so there's this idea of time and adding things in to the layers. And so what she did, she took a cup, just a styrofoam cup, and painted one layer of paint on it every single day. And she would take a picture of it. And then after, I can't remember exactly how long she had it, she had a video of this cup just growing. And it was really interesting to see how, she could have just painted this and put it in an art museum, but she added that element of time, which added a new dimension to it. It was like, okay, anyone who's looking at it could think about how it had grown and how, right, maybe 3 months ago it looked different than it did now, and 3 months from now it'll look different than it does, today. And so, so that was another thing that sort of added a little bit of fuel to this idea of maybe I could write a story every single day, and it would show this progression.
What I'd like to see is a cross-section of it. Just cut the cup in half and see what it looked like as well.
Yeah, that would be really cool.
Well, I know a lot of folks who take on a 30 or even 100-day challenge to create something and really push themselves. But the discipline of creating a body of work over 365 days is a whole different level of mindset. I post a question of the day every day on Facebook as a discipline for myself of just process and curiosity. But a lot of days, my brain just feels too tired almost to pop one out. Again, I always do, but it's one sentence, one question. A written story every day just whelms my mind. Talk with me about the mindset of going into this project and how it evolved over the course of it, throughout the year.
Yeah. So, yeah, you're right. It was extremely challenging, and there were points in the project where I was just like, I'm way too tired to write a story. But it was almost like an obsession. Just I'm not going to sleep until I write a story.
That's cool.
And it was really crazy.
To a point.
Yeah. When I started out though, I wasn't thinking, oh my gosh, I have this massive volume of work ahead of me that I have to complete. I really just thought of it one day at a time. And that was crucial because if I thought about it anything else, I wouldn't have been able to accomplish it, I don't think. And it was interesting because when I first started out, I wasn't thinking of this massive 365, 2-volume book collection. I was thinking, let me just write a story. I've done this before. I can write a story. And so when I started out, the stories almost weren't very self-aware. They weren't aware. The stories didn't feel like they were part of this massive collection. That changed over time. The last story that I wrote was very much aware that it was the last story, whereas the first story that I wrote, it almost had no idea that it was the first story. It was like, all right, you're the first. And it was like, what? Like, I don't know what's going on. So it was interesting because there was definitely an evolution in the types of stories that came along. I think the first couple months were sort of fun ideas or memories that I took and then altered and then turned into an interesting story. And so there was a lot of that sort of memory type of stuff or fun little thoughts about like, oh, wouldn't it be cute if such and such happened? And so a lot of the first couple months were that. And then I think maybe by the third and fourth month, that was when I started to realize, I'm not going to be in New York for much longer. In fact, that was when my good friend from school, he gave me a call and said, "Hey, move back to Raleigh and help me start this company." And that was an interesting transition. So a lot of these stories were sort of influenced by this idea that I had put so much into moving to New York, but I wasn't going to stay there for much longer. And so a lot of the stories were thinking about that and sort of leaving and starting something new. And then it's funny because there was one week in the summer when it was in between living in New York. I just moved away from New York and I was about to move to Raleigh. And I spent 1 week at the beach with my family. And so it was interesting because it was this 1 week where I had very little stress or no stress at all. And I'm in a different environment and I'm feeling much more creative. And so I got like 3 awesome stories that I love out of that 1 week. It was really funny. And then after that, the project became very difficult at about 9 months into this project. So I moved back to Raleigh, had a little bit of a burst of, new feeling and new inspiration because I was in Raleigh. And 9 or 10 months into the project was when things started to get really difficult. And this happens in a lot of creative projects. You run out of the easy ideas that your mental pathways sort of go to. You run out of these mental pathways, and then you start to have to go down like trails that are completely unblazed, and you have to hack your way through them and really go places that you haven't thought about before.
Deeper and darker?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, not necessarily darker, maybe a little bit. I don't know. I have to, ask my audience about what they think of these stories, but yeah, definitely to some degree. You start to consider new ways of telling stories, new characters, things that you haven't expected before. And then, that was sort of the final push into the last couple of months of the project.
Did you feel more vulnerable while you were in that creating process, or a year later when you're actually releasing them?
It was a little bit of both, because when I was writing them, I didn't think too much about, people are going to read these. My mom's going to read these. My grandparents are going to read these. My friends are going to read these. I didn't think too much about that. And so there was a vulnerability to the page for me, but there wasn't a vulnerability in terms of, people are going to ask me about these stories or say, oh, I loved that one, or like, oh, that one was weird. But much later, the next year, whenever I'd I'd copy and paste all the stories into, wherever I was publishing them online. And, I'd have to be the one to click publish. Right. And so at that point, that was a little bit of vulnerability there. But, it was almost like this project was a living entity, and I was like, I can't stop it now. Like I've already I've done a Kickstarter, and people are expecting this to show up at their door. So it's part of the process.
Yeah. How has that process changed your connection with other people in terms of empathy or relationship? Did that vulnerability create different connections for you over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that in any sort of storytelling, it does do that, because if you look at what a story is taking someone else's perspective. And I think you have to have a lot of empathy to be a really good storyteller. I think that as I was writing these stories, especially living in New York, it was very interesting to try and, I would be in a situation, I would walk through somewhere, and I would start to think, oh, I wonder what that person is feeling today, or like, I wonder why that person said that, or why did this person do that thing? And I would have to think like, okay, what is the story behind that? And that actually sparked a lot of very interesting stories, just from that idea of like empathy and trying to connect with people in that way. Okay. So yeah, I would say storytelling it's a great exercise because it forces you to process and think about these different things.
Let me get you to read one of your stories and then just go into a little bit of the background on that particular one.
I'm going to read one that I wrote during that week that I was talking about, the week when I was on vacation. This story is called Frying Makes Everything Better. It didn't matter what the hell it was. If my papa got a hold of it, he would fry it. And when he fried it, you would eat it. It was a long-standing tradition in my family, passed down from generations. And by generations, I mean that my papa started it. His ineffable smile would bleed right through his thick, stocky mustache as he handed you a plate of irresistibly crispy fried seafood. It was understandable. Frying food is the easiest way to make something taste good. So when he opened his restaurant, it made sense that he would fry his food. His first menu had only one thing that wasn't fried. He might as well have birthed my brothers and me in frying oil. We grew up on fried baby food. If something didn't taste right, it was because it wasn't fried enough. Fried shrimp, fried crabs, fried oysters, fried mussels, fried okra, fried tomatoes, fried hush puppies. And that was just the beginning. I haven't even started on the fried fish yet, but I'll save that for later. That could take all night. His restaurant became a staple in the Low Country. People drove hours and waited in lines that wrapped around the building so they could consume inordinate amounts of fried food. My papa shuffled between the hot, grease-splattering kitchen and the cool, screened-in dining rooms, saying things like, "It doesn't matter what it is, frying makes everything better." And it was true. Frying made everything better. Everyone believed that. That's why everyone came to this tiny seafood shack tucked away near the shore in the Low Country of South Carolina, between the marsh and the seaside. I believed wholeheartedly that frying made everything better. At least, I used to. By the time I neared high school graduation, I was ready for a lot of things, but most of all, I was ready to get the hell out of the Low Country. I surprised a lot of people, including myself, with the schools that I applied to. I received more than my share of uncertain questions. But before I knew it, my acceptance letter from NYU arrived in the mail. Papa waddled into the house, reeking of grease and happy customers, carrying the stack of mail. He sorted through them, one letter at a time, until he saw the royal purple envelope from New York City, addressed to me. He handed it to me, then plopped down at the table across from me. "You want to talk about it?" I looked it over, hiding my excitement. My head started to race with all of the opportunities and the people and the connections and the friends and the enemies and the companies and the ideas I could interact with in the next 4 years. "Sure," I said. "Well, what are you thinking?" he mumbled. I looked down at the letter, then back up, trying not to smile. "I think I'm going to go." It's pretty different up there, you know." "I know. Lots of different people. It's expensive there." "I know. You'll have to watch out, too. Lots of gangs. And queers." "Yeah, I've been there, Papa. I saw those things." He shifted his round belly in his chair, evidence of the long-standing tradition of fried food. "Well," he started, but sputtered, like an engine of a John boat that hadn't been run in years. Finally, he started back up again. "So you don't want to run the restaurant? I mean, eventually, sometime." My fingers began to play with the envelope. "I can't. I mean, not like that, Papa. This is my chance to get out. Do something else, you know?" He nodded, his whole body shaking in unison. He said nothing. Then, finally, "Yeah, Yep, you'll do good. I'll get a business degree, so, maybe I can do something after. With the restaurant, I mean. Yeah, he grunted with a glimmer of enthusiasm. Yeah, that'd be good. He was right about the city. It was expensive, and it was different. There were gangs, and there were queers, lots of them. They didn't have seafood, at least not what I called seafood. I got strange looks when I said things like y'all and called my dad Papa. People said my accent was cute and asked me where the hell I was from. Dad knew things were different when I came home from Christmas my senior year. He knew because I didn't call him that. Dad, not Papa. I'd never called him Dad. None of my brothers had ever called him Dad. I didn't miss the humid stench of the low country marsh or the thick buzz of mosquitoes on a wet, hot summer eve, but I sure as hell did miss that fried food. So we got into Dad's pickup and drove to his restaurant. He'd moved to a new location. It was bigger, more cultured, if you want to call it that, cleaner and more attractive. The kitchen was 3 times the size of the last one and had more frying baskets than a Yankee chef would know what to do with. Dad led me into the kitchen, spreading his arms like a chubby southern god showing off his creation. It doesn't matter what it is, frying makes everything better. I smiled, but restrained myself. The kind of smile you might have when you still have bad news in your pocket that you haven't taken out yet. We sat down and ate. Fried fish, fried shrimp, fried crabs, fried oysters, fried mussels, fried okra, fried tomatoes, fried hush puppies. Finally, he wiped the grease from his mustache and looked up. What are you going to do come May? The question caught me off guard, but only because I knew it was coming. I got an offer in Charleston and one in Charlotte, investment firms, really good opportunity to learn. I've been in contact with one of the partners at... Not coming back here? I paused. I can't, Dad. He stood, suddenly and violently. He bumped the table, clanging the silverware and the plates, and scooted out from his chair, storming away. When fish doesn't have a strong taste, or when it's been frozen, or when it's not as fresh as it probably should be, you can always fry it. You won't know the difference. But there's nothing like that with words, or with feelings, or with people. I can't fry my feelings when they aren't strong. I can't fry my words when they're frozen or stilted or stale. I can't fry my dad, my papa, when our relationship is not as fresh as it used to be, or when it's nearing an expiration date. My dad left me at the restaurant that night. I walked out into the gravel parking lot and saw that his pickup was gone. My brother picked me up, took me back to the house, but Dad didn't say anything to me, and 2 days later I went back to New York. It doesn't matter what it is. Frying makes everything better, but you can't fry everything.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was, it gets very emotional. You can dive into these characters' lives, and it's really interesting. I have this sort of, it's funny because I have a disclaimer at the beginning of my book that says, these things are not true. But if they were, there would be things that are changed. And it's interesting because it makes everyone wonder, like, oh, well, is this true? Like, is this true? And I had to say for that one, like, it's not true. Like, my dad does not own a restaurant. I didn't grow up in South Carolina. My parents weren't expecting me to go back to the city where they live. But it makes you think a lot when you spend a week with your family about what are the expectations you have for your family, and then what are the expectations you have for yourself. And it makes you think a lot about the kinds of choices you're making in your career. At that point, I was right about to join this startup. And so there was probably a lot of questions just running around about, what is it going to be like to work at a startup? Is this the right decision? And that sort of thing. So, there may be undertones in any story, any of my stories, that are inspired by real things, real questions that I have in life. But, fortunately, I've never been in a situation where my parents wouldn't talk to me or anything like that. So yeah, that was one that I wrote right in the middle of the year. I think also being in South Carolina at the time when I wrote that was very impactful and,
of course,
and influenced me a lot. Whenever you're in a location, when you're writing about that location, and I could go out at the beach or walk around and see just sort of the marshlands of South Carolina. It's absolutely beautiful, and it's very inspiring when it comes to writing about it. And when you can be there and feel the heat, and South Carolina has these amazing summer evenings where it's been hot all day, and then it finally sort of cools off in the evening.
Yes, it does.
And so it was a perfect time to write these kinds of stories.
Where are you from?
So I grew up in North Carolina. My parents currently live in Winston-Salem, so that's where I spent all of my high school growing up. And we have a lot of relatives in South Carolina, so we'd go back and visit.
Yeah. I grew up in Charleston. That's why
okay.
I ask. So
yeah,
you took
I
me
love
there.
Charleston. Yeah, it's amazing.
You took me to your dad's restaurant.
Yeah.
So.
No, the fried food in Charleston, like you cannot get better than that.
I know the place, wherever that place is.
Yep.
That's good. What are some of the insights that became apparent to you along the way as the result of your daily process? Anything that grew?
Yeah. I think that it was interesting because at the end of this whole project, at the end of the year, it was the first week of 2015 when I wasn't writing a story every single day. I finally had gotten sort of a break in writing. It was very interesting because when I stopped writing every single day, I almost realized the effects of it, and which was the most poignant one was that the first week when I wasn't writing a story, I had the most vivid dreams. And it was interesting because I started to realize, just the habits that I was making for myself. I would usually get done with work, and I would go back to my apartment, and I would sit down and I would write, and it would be the last thing that I would do right before I went to bed. And so the first week when I wasn't doing that, my mind was almost primed to put these narratives together and craft this sort of, conflict or narrative into a character or whatever. And that week I just had extremely vivid dreams because I wasn't sitting down and putting that on paper, but my mind was still working that way. My mind was still thinking of like, okay, what is this story that I'm going to put together? When I didn't sit down and write it out, my mind was like, well, it's got to go somewhere. Like, let's act it out when I was asleep. And so that was really cool. And I started to realize, it was almost like a survival mode because every single day, I knew the one thing I had to do before I went to sleep was come up with a story. And so that week, even when I didn't need to come up with a story, it was the first week when I was done with this project, I would, go for a run, and I would come back to my apartment. I'd realize like, wow, I have like 5 ideas for stories. And so it was very much priming my mind, not just to write the story, but to develop the story in my mind. Right. So it was sort of an unexpected consequence of that.
Were you disappointed at all in that first week not writing? What was your emotional state?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wasn't necessarily disappointed. I think at that point I was very exhausted from writing every single day for an entire year, and I'd put so much into it, and that I was actually just very relieved to be at a point where I could stop and look back and reflect on the project. And a lot of people would ask me like, "Oh, are you going to keep writing?" And I was like, "Yeah, I had a lot of ideas." And the interesting thing was, I did have some ideas where I realized this is not going to fit into a short story. I've got to turn this into a script or a screenplay or turn it into a novel. And so now I'm working on a novel, and that I think I did get sort of the idea during this project, but I didn't sit down and turn that into a short story. It was much more of something I was like, I'm going to save this for later. And so it took me a little while to get back into writing again like that because it was just so rigorous writing every single day.
Right.
But overall it was a very good exercise. And that first week that I was done, I was like, all right, this is great. Like, I can go to sleep with whenever I want. I don't have to write anything. So, yeah.
A lot of creatives use crowdfunding to get their dream project launched, but it's not just a matter of throwing your ideas on a web page and money starts pouring in, from what I understand. I had a two-part conversation a while back with Clay Bear, who is a thought leader in that crowdfunding space. But we talked about the elements of a successful crowdfunding campaign. And again, it's not easy. What are some of the lessons that you learned that others could benefit from your experience of having completed a successful campaign?
Yeah, good question. So I did a lot of research into what makes a good Kickstarter campaign. I used Kickstarter specifically. I think the biggest thing is you can't be shy about your project. You have to be willing to tell people about it as much as you possibly can. And when I say tell people about it, I don't just mean like, oh, I tweet about it every day, or, oh, I post on Facebook every day. I mean, you create messages and you send messages to everyone. And so I did that. I would literally just go down my list of friends on Facebook and send people messages. And I would say, oh, hey, maybe it's been a while. Maybe I talked to them just last week, but I want to let you know about this project that I'm doing. I'd love if you could support me just by posting it on Facebook. If you could support me by getting a book for yourself, if you could support me just by, helping out with, a photo shoot that I'm doing or something, like hold the book and I'll take a picture of you reading it. So that sort of thing. So it was very much not just focused on like, hey, I really want you to buy my book. It's much more of like, hey, I'm doing this project. Maybe there are ways you could support the project, and I'd love to talk about it. Like, I think that any sort of creative project, I love to be able to share it, and I love to be able to hear what other people think about it and hear their feedback. And so, it was very much rooted in that. Like, how can I get the word out in a way where I'm not just getting support from people, but I'm getting their feedback, because their feedback is oftentimes much more valuable.
Right. Back to the feedback loop again.
Yeah, exactly.
Are there any revelations that have come to you now that the process is more or less done? The book's printed, shipped, or being still shipped in the process. Has your perspective shifted at this point? Any end in sight revelations or perspectives that you can share?
Yeah. So that's I think it is interesting because your perspective does change a little bit as you go through a project like this. And just looking back, it makes you sort of think. One question that I had, and I'm not even sure what the answer is, but the question I had was for myself was, if I had just committed to one story every week, would I have, I would have obviously like maybe, I would have 52 stories instead of 365, a lot fewer, but maybe they would be better. And so it was an interesting thing to think about, like, okay, quality versus quantity, and is there really a value or is it worth writing 365 short stories as opposed to 52 short stories in 1 year? And, what would I learn differently? What would I have learned differently from writing just 52 in 1 year as opposed to 365 in 1 year? And I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. I'm not sure what I would have learned differently. I think I obviously would have had more time to write each story. And so maybe I would have gotten better at not just the act of coming up with an idea, but the act of revising and thinking through it and really trying to pull out every different step of the process, and the narrative arc and things like that, and the characters. But I'm glad that I did the project wrote a story every single day, because the things you learn from that, in regards to the discipline of doing it every single day and just seeing the effects, and then also putting out that much volume of work, is incredible. And so it's really cool to use that as a way to share the ideas that I have. And then, also just being able to write something like that and really just turn your daily thoughts into a story every single day. Like, whatever you're thinking about that day, turn it into a story and then get people's feedback on it. That was really cool.
Yeah. Let me get you to read another short one, and then maybe something that had, some kind of impact or epiphany that came out of it that kind of transformed your thinking in the process, if you can find something of that.
Definitely. So it was near the end of the year, the end of the project, the last month. I had this story was written on December 15th So, the end was in sight. There was a light at the end of the tunnel. And so at this point, I was really, but it was very, very difficult at this point. I had gone a whole year. It was getting colder. It was getting darker earlier. And it was, putting me in sort of a mental mindset of like, I just want to be done with this project. And so I felt in a lot of ways that I was really scraping the floor of my mind to try and find these ideas, and really having to dig very deep to try and find these ideas. And so at this point, I was really unsure about where the project was going. I had launched the Kickstarter, and so I was in this mindset of, I'm having to face this blank page every single day, and even if I finish it today, I'm going to have to face it tomorrow too. And so it was difficult to face that every single day, and then it was difficult to not only have to face that, but then share all of the stories that I was unsure about with all people to try and raise support for the Kickstarter. So this story was really exciting because right after I shared it, I immediately knew that everyone that had heard this story connected with it. And it was this one special moment where I read it to a group of friends, and the way they all reacted made me understand, like, wow, these stories really connecting with people. And so this one was really special to me because of that. Right. This story is called The Creation Story, and I wrote it on December 15th, 2014. Far too many creation myths and origin stories claim that some god crafted us out of dirt or clay or the dust of the earth. I'm not sure why. There's nothing romantic about being made from the ground that we walk on, although maybe, at the very least, it's poetic. Maybe we won't feel as bad knowing that we'll end up in the dirt if we believe we came from it. But I harbored a festering skepticism, so I stepped outside on a bright sunny day when the earth looked most alive and willing to answer, and I asked it, "Where did I come from, Earth? What am I?" I don't know if you've ever asked anything of the ground, but if you have, then you know. It's slow to answer and doesn't like to be bothered. So I waited. Finally, it spoke in a gravelly voice and told me to ask the wind. The wind speaks much more frequently than the earth, but every word fades in and out, and its voice is a faint whisper. So I called out loudly and strained my ears for an answer. Through the leaves and the clouds, I caught a wispy ghost of a voice. It swirled around me, circling me, until it finally swept its sounds together and formed words that I could understand. "Ask the sun," it whispered to me. "The sky knows." I pulled my coat over my shoulders against the wind and climbed a nearby hill. The sun shone brightly, and as I reached the peak of the hill, I screamed, loud and brilliant. "What am I, sun? Where did I come from?" But the sun just laughed, a warm, comforting laugh. No cynicism tainted its mirth, but it wove no answer into its chorus of sunshine either. "Ask the moon," it said, and then slowly sank into the horizon, like a child playing hide-and-seek. I sat on the hill, on a bed of grass, and waited for the moon to arrive. It curled into the sky, a sharp crescent with a silver smile that beckoned my questions. "Where did I come from, moon? Do you know?" The moon's jovial mime left me unsure that I would ever receive an answer, or that it would do anything other than smile at me silently. Finally, when it reached the middle of the sky, the moon grinned and said, "The ocean knows, my friend. The ocean knows almost everything." I shrugged and watched the moon fade from the night sky, dodging and dancing behind clouds as it went. When the sun finally reappeared, laughing warmly, I stood and walked to the shore. The ocean wasn't far, a 30-minute walk from the city. The seaside drew a reserved serenity that had nested in my soul, hidden for far too long. I walked up to the ocean and stepped barefoot into the waves. Before I could ask it, it knew what I was there for. "Why are you worried about where you came from?" it asked me, waves rumbling back and forth. "What else would I be worried about?" I whispered. The ocean laughed and crashed. More waves lapped up against the miles of sand. "You're more than just you. You're made up of tiny little things, all put together to make something else, aren't you? You're not one thing, even though you act like it. You're just a tiny little bit, made up of other tiny little bits." I shut my eyes, and the sound of the waves crashing suddenly became the sound of traffic racing past. The traffic faded and became ocean once again. I opened my eyes, and the ocean continued. "All of you humans just blend together. I can hardly see any difference between you. So don't be concerned with where you came from, because the pieces that made you came from somewhere else." I thought about that for a while. There was something poetic about it, but maybe not as poetic as being made of dust and returning to it in the end. The ocean's abstract meanderings sounded nice, but they clanked against my mind. I turned away, and my eyes set on the city in the distance. I couldn't argue with the ocean. Everything around me was just something smaller, thousands of tiny parts bonded together to form a whole. Millions and millions of grains of sand formed miles and miles of beach, which in turn formed the structure of the continent. Millions of blades of grass all wove together until they formed the cushioning blanket for the earth to wrap itself in. I turned back to the ocean. "You're not one thing either," I challenged it. The ocean just crashed and lapped at me, but I continued. "You don't believe me, do you?" I said. "What about the raindrops? What would you be without them?" The waves continued, but the ocean didn't respond. The ocean was, no doubt, shocked and surprised to realize that it was made of nothing more than millions of water droplets, just as I was hesitant to accept the composite of my own existence. I turned away from the sea and walked back to the city, meshing into the vast network of streets and cars and people and sidewalks. Yes, the ocean was stunned, but have no doubt, the droplets were far more surprised to find that they formed an ocean than the ocean was to find that it was only made of rain.
That's great.
It was really cool writing this one. It was cool hearing the reaction from my friends and reading it to my friends and hearing their thoughts. It was funny because when I read this, it was only a couple days after I had written it, and I had written it and I felt pretty good about it. I was like, all right, I like this one, and I had been in a conversation with some of my friends about just some different ideas and philosophies, and then I was like, oh well, let me read the story. So I read the story and got a really great reaction about it. So it was really great to hear that.
In your TEDx talk, you made the statement that everything we create is connected. That kind of resonated in that story, all the connections that are happening. What are some of the attributes that you believe make a good creation? How do you see that connection and creation coming together?
Yeah, so I do touch on this a little bit in the TED Talk that I gave, and I do think it's interesting because when I went to school for design, I started to realize and really look for just these fundamental design principles, basically, that could be applied to anything that anyone makes. And most of the time when we think about design, we think, design is a graphic design or architecture or product design or something like that. But if you think about design as in, a series of choices about something to have a certain intention or for a specific purpose, then we all make designs every single day. You design your route to work. You design what you're going to wear that day. You design, what you're going to eat, and you design your schedule. So I think that some really important things to think about in design or any sort of act of creation and the way that they're connected is contrast and hierarchy are two things that are very important. So in terms of hierarchy, it's like, what is the most important fundamental principle about this creation? So, for example, what's the fundamental principle of the first story that I read about frying food? Frying makes everything better.
Right.
Sort of this idea of direction, this idea of expectations, family expectations. And so if that's the guiding principle, and that is sort of in the hierarchy of the most important fundamental principle, then everything in that story should be around that. And the second story that I read, the creation story, it's this idea of how are we connected? And so every experience, every sentence that's in that story should relate back to that most important principle, which is, where do we come from? And so I think hierarchy is something that's very important. If you have muddled hierarchy, then you might not be sure what is this story about. I don't know, because there isn't enough hierarchy in it. But if there's very clear hierarchy, like this is the most important thing, this is the second most important thing, then it's very much easier for people to communicate because they understand, oh, that story is about this story is about that. And the second thing that I mentioned is contrast. So if stories have no contrasting, stories in particular, but anything, this could be the same for your dinner. If your
photograph or anything
or a photograph,
else.
yeah. If your creation has everything is within one category and it's all very homogeneous, it lacks contrast, then there's nothing to compare it to easily. So, for example, one good example is in the first story that I read, Fry Makes Everything Better. There's this contrast of the two locations, the two cities, right? There's the South Carolina, the Low Country. Everything's spread out. It's very very hot, very warm, humid, and there's sort of this carefree attitude, but there's also this expectation. Contrast that with New York City. It's very dense, it's very tight, it's very cold, lots of people all around, but at the same time, there was no expectation for this character, right? So this character, no one in New York City was saying, oh, I really want you to work at this job. He was very much free in the sense where he could make any sort of decision he wanted to. So you take these two scenarios and contrast them, and suddenly they become very poignant. Whereas if I had just said, oh yeah, South Carolina, it's very wide open space, you could get that idea of being there, but you wouldn't have anything to bounce it off of. And so by posing those two places, you get that contrast.
On a day-to-day basis, what have you learned over the process of the last couple of years of doing this work that you use when you're managing teams and working and trying to manage the collaborative process in what you're doing day-to-day now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that managing teams is so fundamentally about communication and being able to communicate well and understanding the goals. And so it does relate to storytelling in some ways because, obviously in storytelling you want to clearly communicate what you're trying to do. But at the same time, it's almost that guiding principle. Like, what is the guiding principle of this story? What is this story really about? What's the core thing? And then in the same way, when you're working with in a startup or in a company and you're guiding a team, you have to think very carefully about what is the goal? What is the thing that we are after? What is the main objective? That's a good word. What's the objective of this story? What's the objective of this team? What's the objective of this meeting? Things like that. And so I think for me, it's just a matter of going through this process over this year of writing these stories was understanding that having a very clear objective for a story is very, very important. If you go into a story and you don't necessarily realize, what is the story about, it becomes very meandering and very unfocused. And that's one thing that you have to avoid when you're running a company is you have to be very focused. So I think that's probably the best example I can give of how these two projects bounce off and add to each other.
So what do you want to be remembered for?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think that I want to be remembered for something I have not done yet. That's what I'm going to have to say is the thing that I want to be remembered for I haven't done yet. It's still ahead of me. So, we'll have to get to that. But I think it's going to be a story. I think that would probably be the thing that I would want to be remembered for.
Good. Is there someone you know who is outside the spotlight but doing something important that's having an impact that the world should know about?
Justin Morgan, he is a pastor, actually. He started a church called Church on Morgan, not related to his name. It's Church on Morgan is the street, and he just happens to be named Justin Morgan, and happens to be the pastor. And it's very interesting to see what he's doing with this church, because I think for a lot of people, they have a certain mindset of what church is, and they have a certain understanding, and they have a certain understanding of how church should function and those sorts of things. But if you think about, in a very creative way, how do you approach something that can have a lot of good in the world, right? There are a lot of great things that can come from having faith in this way. But there are obviously a lot of bad things that can come from it as well. I mean, you just look at history or culture now, and you see a lot of bad things that have come from having faith and this idea of religion. But I see Church on Morgan, and specifically Justin, the pastor, he's very much able to communicate these ideas in a way that are different and are very unique and very much valuable to a community. He's very community-based, and being able to see that and being able to see people come into this community and not feel like, the pressure that a lot of people might feel in these kinds of situations, these kinds of groups and organizations and churches, is something really unique. And a lot of times people don't really pay much attention, like, oh, it's just a church, whatever. Yeah. But this one is very unique. And so it's been interesting to see how that community is growing and be involved in it and see a little bit about how it's developing.
And where's this church located?
It's in downtown Raleigh on Morgan Street.
Of course.
Yeah, it's on the corner of Blunt and Morgan Street.
Good. Well, we'll have information about that as well as some of the other things we've talked about in show notes so people can find it. Perfect. If they want to find more information. Is there one thought that you'd like to leave with our community that you believe could make a difference in their lives?
Yeah. I think that I was thinking about this earlier today. In anything you do, there are always two aspects, right? There's the intention, what are you trying to do, and the execution, how are you doing it? And so for me, in any creative project, I always try and think about this, like, or in business projects as well. This is really important. It's like, what is the goal? What is the intent? What's the objective? And is that objective good? And there are different ways to test that and think about, like, okay, I'm trying to write a book. All right, so how do I get there? And then that goes into the execution side of things. So I think that just in my creative process and my sort of thinking about things, that's one thing that's been very helpful, is to sort of think about it in this very simple way. What's the objective and what's the execution? Because you go around in creative communities and you see people who have great objectives. They have great goals, but the execution is lacking. And there are other people who have great execution. They're just doing whatever they're trying to do. They're doing amazing things, but they also don't have the other side. They don't have the great objective. They don't have the great intention. And so I think it's a meshing of these two that really creates that sweet spot that you want to be in creatively, but also just mentally when you approach a problem or an opportunity.
If folks want to connect with you, what platforms or means are the best for you and for them? Yeah,
probably two ways. If you're really into Twitter, that would probably be the quickest way. If you just have a quick question or want to keep up with what I'm doing, it's Nicholas_Seiler, and then that's Sailer. It's pronounced Seiler though, and then you can send me an email, a story each day @gmail.com. I check that every day, and so I will email you back. I'd love to hear from you, hear your thoughts, hear what you're working on. It's always cool to just connect with other creative people who are following along with your stories.
Well, thanks for letting me come down to HQ Raleigh.
HQ Raleigh.
And have a chat.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad that we were able to talk about all of these different ideas and stories, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to The Creator's Journey. If you enjoyed our theme music, the name of the song is You've Got a Home by Krista Wells. If you enjoyed the show and would like to see it fare well, I would appreciate having you go to iTunes and subscribe. While you're there, if you give us a favorable rating and review, it'll make a huge difference in helping a newcomer easily find it. From a recent review, Charles is such a great host. I love the conversational format and meaningful content. Highly recommend tuning into this show. Thank you. If you want to email me with feedback or suggestions for potential guests, or if you want to connect with any of the guests, or find links to the people and resources that were mentioned in each episode, you can do all of that at thecreatorsjourney.com. Till soon, my friend.